Growing up in a modest apartment above his adoptive parents' corner store, Michael never imagined he'd one day be worth millions. But there he stood, 30 years later, in a crisp suit that probably cost more than his childhood home's monthly rent, staring at a simple suburban house that held the answers to his past. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his watch, not the flashy kind you'd expect from someone who'd built a tech empire, but a weathered timepiece his adoptive father had given him on his 18th birthday. "Stay humble, son," he'd said. Those words had guided Michael through his journey from a curious kid tinkering with computers to a Silicon Valley success story. But today wasn't about business deals or board meetings. For the first time since he was left at that hospital 4 decades ago, he was about to meet the people who brought him into this world. The search hadn't been easy, even with all his resources. Years of private investigators, DNA tests, and dead ends had finally led to this moment. His adoptive parents had supported his search, though he could see the hint of worry in their eyes. "You'll always be our boy," his mom had whispered, hugging him tight before he boarded his flight. He'd reassured her countless times that finding his birth parents wouldn't change their relationship. They were the ones who'd shaped him into the man he was today. The neighborhood was quiet, with kids' bikes scattered across front lawns and the distant sound of a lawn mower. Michael had deliberately dressed down, wearing his old college sweatshirt under his suit jacket. He didn't want his success to overshadow this moment. His heart raced as he remembered the letter he'd sent ahead. A simple introduction, mentioning nothing about his achievements or wealth. Walking up the concrete path, memories flooded back. The countless times he'd imagined this scenario growing up, the questions that kept him awake at night. Why had they given him up? Were they thinking about him too? Had it been a choice made from love or desperation? The doorbell echoed inside the house. Footsteps approached. Michael took a deep breath, clutching the small photo album in his hands, a careful selection of moments from his life that told his story without revealing his fortune. He'd spent weeks choosing which pictures to include, wanting to show them the person he'd become, not just his success. The door creaked open, and time seemed to stop. Standing there was a woman with familiar eyes, his eyes. Behind her, a man appeared, his hands resting supportively on her shoulders. The resemblance was undeniable. 40 years of questions hung in the air between them. But something was off. Their expressions weren't what he'd expected. The woman's hand trembled as she covered her mouth, not with joy or surprise, but with what looked like fear. The man's face had drained of color, as if he'd seen a ghost. Their reaction made Michael's carefully prepared speech die in his throat. I think there's something you need to know," the woman whispered, her voice shaking. She glanced at her husband, who nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. "Please come in. There's a story we've never told anyone. A story about why we had to give you up." As Michael crossed the threshold, he realized this reunion was about to take a turn he never could have predicted. His success, his wealth, his carefully planned revelation, none of that would matter compared to what he was about to learn. Sometimes, the truth comes with a price tag that even a millionaire can't afford. Michael followed them into a living room that felt frozen in time. Family photos lined the walls, each one telling a story of a life he could have lived. The furniture was well worn but carefully maintained, speaking of people who valued what they had. His birth mother gestured toward an old armchair, her hands still trembling as she and her husband settled onto the sofa across from him. The photo album in Michael's lap suddenly felt heavy. He'd imagined this moment differently. Perhaps tears of joy, embraces, explanations of circumstances beyond their control. Instead, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. His birth father cleared his throat, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. "That year was complicated," his birth mother began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were young, working at the same hospital. I was a nurse, your father was finishing his residency." She paused, looking at her husband for support. But there was something bigger happening there, something we weren't supposed to know about. Michael leaned forward, the business mogul in him momentarily forgotten as he found himself drawn into their story. His birth father took over, his voice steady but strained. The hospital had a special wing, officially for research. But we started noticing things. Paperwork that didn't add up, patients who disappeared from records, medications that weren't standard protocol. One night I was working late. His mother continued, twisting her wedding ring nervously. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. Files about experimental treatments, lists of names, pregnant women who had been part of what they called the program. Her eyes met Michael's, filled with a mix of love and regret. I was already pregnant with you. The room seemed to grow smaller as Michael processed their words, the success story he'd planned to share, the carefully prepared speech about forgiveness and understanding. None of it seemed relevant anymore. His birth father stood up, walking to a locked cabinet in the corner. From it, he retrieved a worn manila envelope. We tried to gather evidence, to expose what was happening. He explained, his hands shaking as he held the envelope. But they found out. We had a choice, either participate in their program or he couldn't finish the sentence. Michael's mother reached for her husband's hand, squeezing it gently. We thought giving you up for adoption would keep you safe, she said, tears finally spilling onto her cheeks. We chose a hospital far away, made sure there was no paper trail. We've spent 40 years looking over our shoulders, wondering if they'd ever find us, wondering if you were truly safe. Michael's mind raced, connecting dots he never knew existed. The strange medical conditions he'd experienced growing up that puzzled his doctors, his unusual aptitude for complex problems, his seemingly superhuman ability to focus that had helped build his empire. Could they be connected to whatever happened in that hospital? His birth mother leaned forward, her voice urgent now. But seeing you here, successful and healthy, maybe we were wrong to stay quiet all these years. Maybe it's finally time to. A sudden sharp knock at the front door cut through her words like a knife. The color drained from both their faces. Michael's father quickly stuffed the envelope into Michael's hands. Whatever happens, he whispered urgently, don't let anyone know you have this. The people involved, they never stopped watching. And they're not the only ones interested in what happened back then. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Through the window, Michael caught a glimpse of two men in dark suits standing on the porch. His birth parents exchanged a look that spoke volumes, a look that told him this reunion was about to become something far more complicated than a simple family reconciliation. Without a word, Michael's birth mother gestured toward the kitchen's back door, her eyes conveying what her voice couldn't. Years of running tech companies had taught Michael to think fast under pressure. He slipped the envelope into his suit jacket's inner pocket as his birth father quietly led him through the kitchen, their footsteps barely making a sound on the linoleum floor. The front door knocking grew more aggressive. Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Thompson, this is regarding a matter of national security. The voice was professional, authoritative, but there was an underlying edge to it that sent chills down Michael's spine. Through the kitchen window, he spotted a black SUV with tinted windows idling at the curb. His birth mother stayed in the living room, buying them time. Just a moment, please. She called out, her voice remarkably steady. Michael heard her slowly making her way to the front door, every footstep deliberate. Meanwhile, his birth father opened the back door with practiced care, checking the backyard with experienced eyes. You need to understand something, his father whispered urgently as they crept toward the garden gate. What's in that envelope? It's not just about you anymore. There were others, dozens of children. Some didn't survive the experiments. Those who did, they're out there, probably not even knowing what was done to them. The sound of the front door opening echoed from inside the house. Michael's mother's voice drifted out, calm but firm. I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I'll need to see some proper identification. Her words were clearly a warning signal. They were running out of time. Just as they reached the gate, Michael's tech instincts kicked in. He pulled out his phone, quickly typing in a command to access his company's secure satellite network. I can help, he whispered to his father. I have resources, connections. Whatever this is, we can protect you. His father's response was cut short by the sound of heavy footsteps entering the house. Ma'am, we have reason to believe you've been in contact with a person of interest. The voice was closer now, professional pretense starting to crack. We need to conduct a thorough search of the premises." Michael's father gripped his arm, his eyes intense. "Listen carefully. There's a storage facility in Boulder, Unit 23B. What's in that envelope will make more sense once you see what's there. But be careful who you trust, even your closest advisors." He glanced meaningfully at Michael's expensive watch and tailored suit. A crash from inside the house made them both jump. "They're here somewhere," a new voice shouted. The sound of drawers being yanked open, furniture being moved, echoed through the windows. Michael's mother's protests were drowned out by the commotion. Heart pounding, Michael reached for the gate latch, but his father held him back one last moment. "Your adoption wasn't random," he whispered. "Your parents, your real parents who raised you, they were part of something bigger. They protected you all these years without you knowing. Find them, quickly, before they—" The back door suddenly burst open. Two more men in dark suits emerged, weapons drawn. Federal agents. "Don't move." Michael's world seemed to slow down as his father shoved him hard toward the gate, positioning himself between Michael and the agents. "Run," his father shouted. "Find the others. They need to know." His words were cut off by the chaos that erupted in the backyard. Michael's tech empire, his carefully built life, his plans for a simple family reunion, all of it seemed to dissolve in the face of a truth that was rapidly spinning out of control. As he vaulted over the back fence, his phone already executing emergency protocols he'd never thought he'd need, Michael realized his search for his birth parents had uncovered something far bigger than family secrets. The real question now wasn't just who he was, but what he was and who else out there was like him. Michael's tech-enhanced instincts guided him through a maze of suburban backyards as sirens wailed in the distance. His phone buzzed, an alert from his company's security system showing 3 more black SUVs converging on the neighborhood. Whatever he'd stumbled into, these people had resources that rivaled his own. Ducking behind a garden shed, he finally opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were medical records, photographs, and a handwritten letter that made his blood run cold. The photos showed rows of infants in what looked like a research facility, each with a number tattooed on their ankle. His hand unconsciously moved to his own ankle, where a small birthmark, or what he'd always thought was a birthmark, formed the number 23. But it was the letter that changed everything. Written by his adoptive father 20 years ago, it detailed his involvement in what was called Project Prodigy. The words blurred before Michael's eyes. "We were assigned to guide and protect you to ensure your abilities developed naturally. Your success wasn't just hard work, it was designed. But some of us couldn't bear watching children being treated like experiments. We broke protocol. We let our subjects become our children." His phone buzzed again, this time a text from his adoptive mother. "They're here at the house. Don't come home. Remember the lake house. Go there. Trust no one else." The message deleted itself seconds later, a security feature he'd developed himself but never thought his parents would need to use. Distant shouts and the sound of searching feet forced him to move. As he scaled another fence, his mind raced through memories. His inexplicable ability to see patterns others missed, how technology seemed to bend to his will, the way his company had grown so fast it seemed almost engineered. He wasn't just a successful tech entrepreneur, he was a successful experiment. The sound of a helicopter overhead made him freeze. A voice cut through a megaphone. "This is a federal operation. All residents are advised to stay indoors." But something about the announcement felt off to Michael. In all his years dealing with government agencies, he'd never heard of a protocol quite like this. His phone lit up with an incoming call from an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. 23, a distorted voice said. "We've been waiting for you to find out. Check your company's Project Nexus database, the one even your board doesn't know about. Remember that acquisition in Geneva last year? It wasn't random. None of it was." The call ended abruptly. Michael's mind spun. Project Nexus was his most secretive initiative, a quantum computing breakthrough that had seemed to come to him in a dream. But how did this person know about it? And Geneva, where he'd met the mysterious investors who'd helped him expand globally. A sudden movement caught his eye. A figure stepped out from behind a tree, a woman about his age wearing a business suit that rivaled his own. She held up her ankle, revealing a number, 17. Your parents weren't the only ones who broke protocol, she said quietly. Some of us have been watching you for years, waiting for this moment. But we're not the only ones. There's another group of us, the ones who embrace what they were designed to be. They've infiltrated governments, corporations. Before she could finish, the sound of approaching vehicles made them both tense. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Your company's quantum network, their genetic engineering program. It's all connected. But right now, we need to move. Because in about 30 seconds, they're going to realize that the Michael Chen who just used his satellite network to call for help isn't you. The implications hit him like a thunderbolt. Someone else with his capabilities had already started making moves, using his identity. The game was bigger than he'd imagined, and he was no longer sure if he was the player or the piece. As police sirens wailed and helicopter searchlights swept the area, Michael realized his search for his birth parents had unleashed a chain of events that threatened not just his empire, but the very nature of human potential itself. The woman who called herself 17 led Michael through a series of pre-planned escape routes that seemed too perfect to be coincidental. As they moved, she explained how their enhanced pattern recognition abilities had let several subjects find each other over the years, forming a hidden network of their own. They'd been watching Michael's rise in the tech world, recognizing the telltale signs of their shared capabilities. They arrived at what looked like an abandoned subway maintenance tunnel, where 3 others waited, each successful in their own fields, each bearing numbered marks. But it was the 4th person who made Michael stop in his tracks, his adoptive mother, looking somehow both worried and more confident than he'd ever seen her. I'm sorry we had to meet again like this, she said, pulling him into a fierce hug. Your father and I. We were researchers before we became parents. When we discovered what the program was really doing to the children, we couldn't stand by. But there's something even more urgent you need to know. The truth poured out in a flood. Project Prodigy hadn't just created enhanced children. It had created 2 distinct lines of development. One group was designed for technological innovation, the other for social manipulation. Your birth parents, as Mother explained, they discovered that some of the social manipulation subjects had risen to positions of power. They're the ones who've been hunting us, using their abilities to bend entire organizations to their will. Suddenly, Michael's phone sprang to life without him touching it. Code scrolled across the screen as someone else, someone with abilities like his, attempted to breach his quantum encryption. But they'd played right into his hands. Years of paranoia had led him to build backdoors into everything he created. Now, he shouted, initiating a program that had been waiting dormant in his company's systems. Across the globe, servers activated, broadcasting data that his birth parents had hidden decades ago. The truth about Project Prodigy, about the enhanced individuals, about the manipulation, all of it streamed directly to every major news outlet and government agency simultaneously. The tunnel's emergency lights flashed as heavy footsteps approached from both directions. They were surrounded, but Michael smiled, holding up his phone. Check your feeds, he called out to their unseen pursuers. It's over. The whole world knows now. Your social manipulation can't stop the truth anymore. The footsteps stopped. A familiar voice echoed through the tunnel, the same voice that had called him earlier. You think exposing us changes anything? Look at your stock price, 23. Look at what's happening to your company right now. Michael's smile didn't waver as he replied, You mean the company I transferred to my employees last night? The technology I've already released as open source? You can't take what I've already given away. The shadows at the tunnel's entrance shifted as someone stepped into the light. A man wearing an expensive suit and a familiar face. Michael's face, his exact face. But we can still take you, his duplicate said with a cold smile. After all, genetically, we're identical. Project Prodigy's greatest success, duplicated. That's when Michael's adoptive mother started laughing. Did you really think, she asked, that 2 brilliant scientists would spend 30 years protecting him without making a few modifications of our own? She pressed a button on a device in her hand, and Michael felt a strange tingling throughout his body. His duplicate stumbled, clutching his head. The quantum network wasn't just for computers, Michael realized aloud, finally understanding his parents' true genius. It was for us, for our enhanced neurons, and you just connected to it. As federal agents flooded the tunnel, real ones this time, led by another woman bearing a numbered mark, Michael watched his duplicate and the other hostile agents collapse, their enhanced minds overwhelmed by the quantum connection they'd tried to use against him. The very abilities they'd relied on had become their weakness. But as the dust settled and reunions began, Michael noticed his birth father's final words still echoing in his mind: "Find the others." Looking around at the small group of enhanced individuals, he couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't found everyone yet, and somewhere out there, others like him were waiting. Some friend, some foe, all part of a story that was far from over. His phone buzzed one last time. A text from an unknown number, ready for Phase 2. Below it was a photo of another infant from the original project, with a number higher than any he'd seen before. The game wasn't over. It was just changing levels. 6 months after the tunnel incident, Michael stood at a podium in front of his reconstructed company headquarters. The morning sun glinted off the building's windows as he addressed a crowd of employees, journalists, and a special group seated in the front row, his family, both birth and adoptive parents, together at last. The past months had been a whirlwind of congressional hearings, international investigations, and public revelations. Project Prodigy's exposure had initially shocked the world, but humanity's remarkable ability to adapt had slowly transformed fear into fascination, then into acceptance. The enhanced individuals who chose to come forward were no longer seen as experiments or threats, but as people, each with their own story of discovery and choice. His birth parents had been cleared of all charges, their decades-long efforts to protect and expose the truth finally recognized. They'd moved closer to Michael, making up for lost time while respecting the unbreakable bond he shared with his adoptive parents. The family dinners were sometimes awkward, often emotional, but always filled with a sense of healing. Today, Michael announced to the crowd, "We're launching the Prodigy Foundation, not to create more enhanced individuals, but to support those already out there, to help them understand their capabilities and choose their own paths." He smiled at 17, now known as Dr. Sarah Chin, his foundation's head of research. Their shared experience had blossomed into something neither had expected, but both had welcomed. The quantum network had been reproposed, its original controlling functions replaced with protective measures. It now served as a safety net for enhanced individuals, helping them control and develop their abilities while preventing the kind of manipulation that his duplicate had attempted. The duplicate himself, along with his conspirators, faced justice, not as monsters, but as people who'd lost their way. But our greatest discovery, Michael continued, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, wasn't about enhanced abilities or secret programs. It was about choice. Every one of us, enhanced or not, has the power to choose who we become. Our genes might shape our potential, but our choices define our legacy. After the ceremony and a quiet moment with both sets of parents, Michael finally asked the question that had been nagging him. The message about Phase 2, was it real? His adoptive father smiled, pulling out an old photograph. It showed a group of researchers from Project Prodigy's early days, including a familiar face that had been appearing in international news lately. A rising political leader known for his unusually compelling speeches. "There are still others out there," his birth mother added softly. "Some knowing what they are, others still in the dark. Your foundation will help them find their way, just like you found yours." Michael looked around at his unlikely family, the scientists who created him, the parents who protected him, and the fellow enhanced individuals who'd become his allies. His phone buzzed with another text from that unknown number. "Well done, 23. They're ready to listen now. All of them." He smiled, thinking of the quantum network humming beneath the surface of the digital world, ready to protect and connect those still finding their way. His story had started with a simple search for identity, but it had evolved into something far more significant, a revelation that would echo through generations. So, his adoptive mother asked, her eyes twinkling with the same intelligence that had helped her protect him all these years. What's next? Michael looked at the photograph again, then at his family, and finally at the foundation building rising before them. Next, he said, we helped them all find their way home, just like I did. The millionaire in disguise had found much more than his birth parents. He'd uncovered a truth that would reshape humanity's understanding of its own potential. But more importantly, he discovered that family, whether born, chosen, or found, was the greatest enhancement of all.